All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving into the world of Vikings.
We're going way beyond the horned helmets and raiding parties to uncover what made the Viking Age so impactful.
We're talking about their culture, their beliefs, and even how they've stuck around in ways you might not expect.
And to guide us on this deep dive, we've got this amazing article packed with details that really make you rethink what you thought you knew.
Seriously, it's incredible. But before we get lost in the details,
Now let's set the stage.
exactly. So when we talk Vikings, what's the historical time frame we're dealing with?
Think roughly 793 AD to 1066 AD.
Okay, so a good chunk of time there.
Oh, yeah. Over 2.5 centuries where the Vikings really made their presence known across a surprisingly huge area.
And not just in Scandinavia, right?
Yeah.
This article blew my mind with the reach they had.
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? You're talking parts of Europe, Russia. They even made it to North America.
Seriously, North America. That's wild.
It really speaks to their seafaring skills. You got to give them credit for their shipbuilding, specifically the Viking longship.
Those things were incredible.
Total game changer. It wasn't just a warship either. It was a sophisticated vessel for exploration and trade. It allowed them to really navigate the open seas.
Which explains how they got everywhere. They were incredible explorers.
And where they went, they left their mark, that's for sure.
Huh?
Think about the attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD.
Yeah, the article really gets into that, and it's chilling, to say the least.
It was a turning point, really marked the start of the Viking Age for many historians.
This peaceful monastery on this remote island, completely unsuspecting. I mean, can you imagine?
It really shook Europe to its core. You see the Viking ruthlessness, but also this strategic brilliance. A sudden, shocking attack like that. It was a statement, instilled fear, and cemented their reputation.
Not the best way to make friends, but effective for sure.
Definitely made an impression. But Lindisfarne was just the beginning.
Yeah, this was happening all over. So what was the driving force? Why were they doing this?
It's more complex than just loot and glory, although they weren't opposed to those things.
So what was it about Scandinavia at the time?
Well, you got to consider harsh climates, limited farmland. Resources were scarce, and trade routes weren't always reliable.
So raiding, it was also about survival.
Exactly. It was a way to supplement what they were lacking. But you also can't discount the cultural aspect.
Right, they had this whole warrior ethos.
Exactly. Bravery, strength, achieving fame through these daring deeds. It was all hugely important in Viking culture.
It's like a go big or go home mentality, but with, well, a lot more axes involved.
Pretty much. So you've got this combination of economic necessity and a cultural predisposition for adventure and, let's be honest, a bit of mayhem. That's the recipe for the Viking Age.
And they were good at it. You've got these incredible warriors sailing the seas, raiding settlements. It's a pretty wild time to be alive back then.
And it only gets more interesting because it wasn't all just raiding. Eventually, these raids evolved. They wanted to establish a more permanent presence, and that's when we see them integrating into societies across Europe.
And this wasn't always through brute force, was it?
Not always. Sometimes it was through peaceful means, strategic alliances, even marriages.
And sometimes not so much.
Yeah, let's just say they were adaptable.
So we have Vikings becoming ingrained in these different cultures, even becoming leaders. It's a fascinating twist.
It really is, and it just goes to show you there's more to the Vikings than meets the eye. Take Rollo of Normandy, for example. This guy went from leading Viking raids to becoming a ruler in France.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? Talk about a power move.
It really shows just how adaptable and politically savvy the Vikings could be. They were pragmatic, able to form alliances and seize opportunities when they presented themselves.
Rollo's a perfect example of that. He saw a chance to gain power, and he took it, and his descendants ended up ruling Normandy for centuries.
Talk about leaving your mark on the world. Rollo really challenges that one-dimensional image of Vikings as solely focused on raiding and pillaging. There was so much more than that.
Yeah, they were shaping history in ways people didn't even realize at the time. It really makes you think about how we see historical figures, doesn't it? Like, Rollo was a Viking, but he also became a ruler who helped shape a whole region of France. It's wild.
And it reminds us that the Viking Age wasn't just one big, chaotic free-for-all. There were so many layers to their society and their ambitions.
Totally. And speaking of layers, let's dig into something that really surprised me, the everyday lives of Vikings. Because it couldn't have been all raiding and conquering all the time, right?
Definitely not. For every fearsome warrior, there were farmers, craftspeople, families just trying to make a living.
So what was it like back home in Scandinavia for the average Viking family? Paint me a picture.
Well, imagine this. Bustling farmsteads, skilled craftspeople creating beautiful things, and this really vibrant culture with a deep respect for storytelling and artistry.
Hold on, artistry. Okay,
Huh?
this is where my perception of Vikings gets completely flipped on its head. What kind of art are we talking about here?
Think intricate carvings, really detailed metalwork, often with these intertwined animal designs, incredibly lifelike. They called it the gripping beast style. It's really something to see.
Gripping beast style. Okay, that's going straight into my mental Viking dictionary. It sounds like their art was a way for them to express their connection to the natural world, almost spiritual, you know?
Absolutely. And we can't forget about their storytelling traditions. I mean, these weren't just campfire tales, although I'm sure there were plenty of those too.
Well, I bet.
But storytelling held a really important place in their culture. It was how they passed down their history, their legends, their values. Skilled poets and storytellers held a high place in Viking society.
Wow, that's a side of Viking life you don't often hear about. It really adds a whole new dimension to how we see them. But there's one aspect of their culture we haven't touched on yet, and it's kind of a big one, their mythology.
And we can't talk about Viking culture without talking about Norse mythology,
Yeah.
right? Because it wasn't just stories for them. This was their belief system.
Right, it shaped how they saw everything around them. So for those of us who might need a refresher on our Norse gods and goddesses, what are we talking about here?
Well, you've got a whole pantheon of deities representing different forces of nature, human qualities, abstract ideas. There's Odin, the Allfather, god of wisdom, war, poetry. A busy guy.
Seems like it.
And of course, there's Thor, god of thunder, known for his strength and his mighty hammer, Mjolnir.
Can't forget the hammer.
Right. And Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and magic.
Okay, so we're not talking about your typical perfect deities here.
Not even close. And that's what makes Norse mythology so interesting. These gods and goddesses, they weren't these all-powerful beings who were above it all. They had flaws, they made mistakes, they fought with each other, even experienced loss and hardship.
They're relatable, even though they're gods and goddesses.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating parts of their mythology, at least for me, is this whole concept of Valhalla.
Valhalla. It's one of those words, everyone's heard of it, but probably a lot of us couldn't really tell you what it's all about. So break it down for us. What's the significance of Valhalla?
So picture this, a massive hall ruled by Odin himself, where warriors who died bravely in battle got to go when they died. It was their version of the afterlife.
Wait, so dying in battle wasn't the end. You got to hang out in Valhalla with Odin. That's a pretty sweet deal.
It was the ultimate reward. In Valhalla, they would feast, train for Ragnarok, the big final battle at the end of the world, and just live it up as honored heroes.
No wonder Vikings were considered such fierce warriors. They weren't just fighting for land or loot. They were fighting to earn their place among the legends in Valhalla.
Exactly. It's like their whole belief system revolved around this idea of achieving glory through battle. And when you look at some of the legendary figures from the Viking Age, like Ragnar Lothbrok, you can really see those ideals embodied.
Ragnar Lothbrok. Now there's a name that screams legendary Viking. I feel like he kept popping up in this article. Who was he exactly?
Well, he's one of those figures shrouded in both history and myth, but he's believed to have been a Danish king, led tons of raids on England and France. But it's more than just that he embodies this ideal of the Viking spirit. Cunning, ambitious, driven by this desire for both wealth and glory.
And not afraid to go after what he wanted. Didn't he actually attack Paris at one point? That was in the article.
He did, which back then was no easy feat. It was a really gutsy move, and it says a lot about his ambition. He wasn't just raiding for the sake of it. He wanted to cement his place in history.
And he definitely did that. But his story doesn't end there, does it? What about his sons?
Yeah.
They're pretty influential, right?
Oh, yeah. Ragnar's sons, guys like Bjorn Ironside and Ivar the Boneless, they were forces to be reckoned with. They were leading armies, conquering territories. Their exploits had a huge impact on the political landscape of Europe.
So we're talking about a whole family dynasty, leaving their mark on history. It's amazing how much one family's story can tell us about a whole era. It
Yeah.
really is remarkable. I mean, talk about a legacy. But even the most legendary figures, even entire dynasties, they can't dominate forever. So what led to the end of the Viking Age?
Well, it's not like there was one single event that made the Vikings just disappear. It was more of a gradual shift in the balance of power.
So what happened? Did other kingdoms just finally get tired of their shenanigans and decide to fight back?
You could say that. The Vikings' success forced other kingdoms to adapt. They started building stronger defenses, forming alliances, basically becoming a lot harder to raid.
Does the Vikings actually inadvertently help to create their own rivals? That's kind of ironic when you think about it.
It is. Their raids pushed other kingdoms to become stronger and more unified. And on top of that, remember how we talked about the Vikings integrating into different societies? That was happening more and more.
Right, like Rollo and Normandy. They weren't just outsiders anymore. They were becoming part of the system.
Exactly. They were adopting local customs, converting to Christianity, essentially. They were assimilating into the very cultures they had once challenged.
It's a pretty amazing turn of events.
Eh.
But at some point, the Viking Age, as we traditionally think about it, the raids, the conquests, it did come to an end.
It did, and a lot of historians point to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 as a pivotal moment. It wasn't the absolute end of Viking activity, but it marked a pretty significant decline in their power and influence.
Stamford Bridge, wasn't that the battle where the English king, Harold Godwinson, went up against the Viking forces led by Harold Hardrada?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And it was a decisive victory for the English. Hardrada's death was a huge blow to Viking ambitions in England, and it really signaled a turning point in Europe.
So after Stamford Bridge, what happens to the Vikings? They don't just vanish from history, do they?
No way. In fact, their story doesn't really have a neat and tidy ending. It's more like their influence continues, but in a different way. Think about it, we still see traces of Viking culture today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, place names, language. There are even legal systems in parts of Europe that still show Viking influences. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Right. And then you've got Norse mythology, which is having a huge resurgence in popular culture. Look at all the movies, books, video games. Those stories and those gods and goddesses, they're everywhere.
It's true. Thor, Odin, these figures have become pop culture icons. Why do you think these stories have resonated with people for so long?
I think it's because they tap into these universal themes: heroism, fate, the struggle between good and evil. Plus, those Norse gods, they weren't perfect. They had flaws, they made mistakes, which I think makes them feel more relatable, even today.
It's like their stories remind us that even though times change, people, at their core, they're not that different. We still face challenges, we still grapple with questions of fate and free will, and we still tell stories to make sense of it all.
That's a great point. And speaking of stories, we can't forget the Vikings' artistic legacy. Remember those gripping beast designs we talked about?
Those intertwined animal designs.
You can still find those motifs in art and architecture today. It's subtle, but it's there.
It's like these echoes of their culture are woven into the fabric of our world, even centuries late.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful reminder that even cultures that seem very different from our own, they can leave a lasting mark.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners today? What can we learn from the Vikings?
I think their story reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles, it's about people. It's about understanding the choices they made, the challenges they faced, and the legacies they left behind.
And sometimes it's about looking beyond the stereotypes to uncover the unexpected ways in which even the most ancient cultures continue to shape our world. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the Viking Age.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about the Vikings? Head over to our social media and let us know. Thanks for listening.